Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to our Bible study here at Slater United Methodist Church. We've been working through the adult Bible study series that will be published and brought out to United Methodist adult Sunday school classes in the spring of 2022. It begins, in fact, on the first Sunday of Lent with a series of lessons in Mark, and then the last part has to do with what I would call natural theology, or the way that God deals with nature and how God gives revelation and celebrates nature. And so there's something of a conservation theme, I think, that runs through many of these texts. So today, what I want to share with you about Joel is that at the very beginning of the book of Joel, which is one of the minor prophets, as we said last time, we have this situation where there's a plague of locusts that comes through Palestine and destroys the crops. Now, whether this was a literal plague of locusts or was a metaphor for people invading Palestine, like, for instance, the Babylonians, we're not really sure. But our text today talks about, in the aftermath of that horrible plague, what God decides to do. And so we pick up after this plague business, and it says, "Then the Lord became passionate about the land and had pity on his people." So after the plague of locusts comes, God becomes emotionally involved with the land. And this is of some significance, I think, because human beings tend to almost always assume that all God cares about is human beings. We're the crown of creation and so forth. But here we see that even the minor prophet Joel recognizes that God can become emotional about the land, which of course God created. He's also connected to the people because it says here that he had pity on the people. And so that's how we begin. The Lord responded to the people, and this is what he said. "See, I'm sending you the corn, new wine, and fresh oil, and you will be fully satisfied by it." Now, this is a great promise of God, which is given to people who are facing starvation because of the plague of locusts, if it was indeed a plague of locusts. So God is going to give them corn and wine and fresh oil. By that is probably olive oil. And they will be fully satisfied by it. That's the promise of God. Do not worry about starving. I will completely satisfy you. And I will no longer make you a disgrace among the nations. Israel, as a small country who had gone past its prime, the days of David, Israel's territorial expansion was as large as it ever got. But now it's a shrinking kingdom. It's threatened on the south by Egypt. It's been invaded on the north by first Assyria and then Babylon. So here's the thing. They look like a disgrace among the nation because they are not self-protective enough. And so God says that he will no longer make them a disgrace. And then he talks about the northern army far from you. And that probably is the Babylonian army, although it could also refer to the Syrian army. "I will remove the northern army from you and drive it into a dried up and desolate land. Its front into the eastern sea and its rear into the western sea." He's here talking about probably the Sea of Galilee, certainly the Mediterranean Sea, that would be the Western Sea. Its stench, that is the armies' stench that have been defeated, these interloping armies from the outside, these giant multinational sort of armies. Their stench will rise up. Its stink will come to the surface. The Lord is about to do great things. So these verses 18 through 20 really tell us about the promise that God is making, Yahweh is making to his people. And then he speaks to the land. First, he talks about that the Lord is passionate to the land, and then he talks about that he has pity on his people, and then he talks about how he will relieve and act on that pity. Now he comes back to talk about the land. Don't fear, fertile land, rejoice and be glad, for the Lord is about to do great things. That's interesting that he is speaking to the land, but he does. Now, here's the second part. Don't be afraid, animals of the field, for the meadows of the wilderness will turn green. The tree will bear its fruit. The fig tree and the grapevine will give their full yield. Okay, so he's making a promise now to the animal kingdom that they too, like the humans, will not starve because of the locusts, but rather they will be filled by the meadows of the wilderness, and the trees, the fig tree, the grapevine will give its full yield. And then he speaks again to the children of Zion. He says, rejoice and be glad in the Lord your God, because he will give you the early rain as a sign of righteousness. He will pour down abundant rain for you, the early and the late rain as before. Now, what this is talking about, in Israel, in a typical agricultural year, there will be an early rain, and right after that, the people plant their crops because the soil is softened up for plows to run into it and so forth. And then later on, a few months later on, they have what are called the late rains. And these are heavy rains that water the crops and cause them to grow. And so this is another aspect of the promise of God. The early rain and the late rain will be a sign of blessing to them. And then he says, the threshing floors will be full of grain. The vats will overflow with new wine and fresh oil. I will repay you for the years that the cutting locust, the swarming locust, the hopping locust, and the devouring locust have eaten. In other words, you can see that locusts were very much on Joel's mind when he's making this prophecy. And God, through Joel's prophecy, basically tells the people that he will make it up to them what they've suffered by this business of the locust. My great army which I sent against you, that is what he calls that's what Yahweh calls the locust. But now God is repenting in the sense that God is changing God's mind. God is changing God's perspective on how he will deal with his people. First, there was punishment or judgment. The day of the Lord, images come to mind. But then God relents or repents of his sin against the people, and he says, now you will eat abundantly and be satisfied, and you will praise the name of the Lord your God, who has done wonders for you, and my people will never again be put to shame. You will know that I am, and of course that is a reference to I am Yahweh. That's what the revelation of the God's name was to Moses at the burning bush. I am in the midst of Israel, and that I am the Lord your God. No other exists. Never again will my people be put to shame. And so this idea of starving and watching their animals starve and seeing their land stripped bare of vegetation, that is all shameful. To be invaded by Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, that is shameful. And what God's promise to these people is that they will no longer be shamed. And then here is what Peter quotes in the Pentecost sermon in Acts 2. This is from Joel. After that, I will pour out my spirit upon everyone. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions. In those days I will also pour out my spirit on male and female slaves. I will give signs in the heavens and on earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. What this is one of the Bible's great promises, that God will pour God's Spirit out on everyone, whether they are slaves, whether they're men, women, whether they're young, whether they're old, doesn't matter. God will be there to provide for the people. We want to turn now briefly to Romans, and what this is something of a mini hymn about creation and God's relationship with creation. Now, you will remember that Paul writes this part of Romans probably 4 or 5, maybe even 6 centuries after Joel has made his prophecy. So this is what Paul writes to the church at Rome. The text, of course, is 8:19 through 22. The whole creation waits breathless and with anticipation for the revelation of God's sons and daughters. In other words, creation can be patient, but it waits breathless, which is a way of saying that there is a deep, deep anticipation on behalf of creation. Creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice. It was of the choice of the one who subjected it, but in hope that the creation itself will be set free from slavery and decay and brought into the glorious freedom of God's children. That is, that no longer will the creation be subject to the whims of what we might call natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, fires, any of that stuff, that the creation, like the people that live upon the surface of the creation, will also be blessed. We know that the whole creation is groaning together and suffering labor pains up until now. It is ready to give birth. Now, what this is basically a symbol of the new creation. When Yom Yahweh occurs, when the day of the Lord triggers a whole new creation, this is in part what it is. You might say, I've never heard this before, I am reluctant to even say it, but in a way, the day of the Lord in this particular verse seems to me like a woman who breaks her water about ready to give birth. When the water is broken, that is a sign that a new birth is coming. And so Yom Yahweh, Day of the Lord, is in a way, when we see that, we know that God is going to do a new thing. That's what Isaiah says, and that is what Paul is alluding to as he writes about the creation groaning together and suffering labor pains. I thank you for being with us today, and I look forward to seeing you next week. And our lesson next week is going to be 2 Corinthians 9. So appreciate you being with us today.